somewhere between a routine state visit and a few signed papers. A rule that quietly controlled African movement for decades disappeared. Think about how often movement decides your life. Where do you study? Where do you work? Who you trade with? Who you collaborate with? Now think about how rarely Africans get to move inside their own continent without explanation, delay, or permission. That's why this matters. Not because it's about travel, not because it sounds progressive, but because it removes a delay that shaped choices long before people noticed it existed. So what exactly was removed? Why was it done quietly? And what does it unlock once people stop waiting? Let's find out. What was removed was the visa, but not in the way people usually imagine it. This wasn't a pilot program, not a discussion, not a promise for the future. Ghana and Zambia scrapped visa requirements outright for each other's citizens. If you hold a Ghanaian passport, Zambia no longer treats you as a case to be processed. If you're Zambian, Ghana no longer asks you to explain yourself before entry. You arrive, you enter, you move. That's the change. Simple. Final. The decision was confirmed during an official visit when John Dramani Mahama landed in Lusaka and was received by Hakainde Hichilema. On the surface, it looked like standard diplomacy. Airport photos, formal talks, joint statements. But buried inside those meetings was the part that actually alters daily life: mobility without pre-approval. Here's what's important. This wasn't framed as generosity, and it wasn't marketed as ideology. No one stood on a podium saying, "We are liberating Africa." That's intentional. Loud framing invites opposition. Quiet implementation changes reality before anyone can block it. Visas are usually removed when countries want tourists, or when one side is clearly more powerful. This wasn't that. Ghana and Zambia are not neighbors. They don't share a border. There's no obvious short-term tourism boom that justifies urgency. Which means this wasn't convenience, it was a choice. And that choice didn't just remove paperwork, it removed a decision point. Before this, a Ghanaian thinking about Zambia had to stop and ask, is it worth the process? A Zambian considering Ghana had to factor in time, cost, and uncertainty. That pause quietly killed many plans before they ever started. Now that the pause is gone. The key detail people are missing is when this happened. It didn't come after a crisis. It wasn't forced by protests. It wasn't a response to pressure. It happened in calm conditions, during a routine visit, which tells you something important. The decision wasn't reactive, it was premeditated. Governments don't remove control mechanisms accidentally. They do it when the cost of keeping them becomes higher than the risk of letting them go. And that's the first real signal in this story. Because if visas were harmless, they wouldn't need to be removed quietly. If they were irrelevant, no one would bother changing them. The fact that this happened without drama tells you the opposite, that the rule mattered enough to be handled carefully. So, the real question isn't what was removed, it's this. What were those visas quietly preventing people from doing in the first place? What those visas were preventing wasn't movement itself, it was follow-through. People imagine visas as gates, open or closed. In reality, they function more like speed breakers. They don't stop you outright. They slow you down just enough for plans to fall apart on their own. Think about how decisions actually happen. Someone hears about a course in another country. A trader spots demand across a border. A startup founder wants to test a new market. None of these moments begins with certainty. They begin with momentum. And momentum is fragile. The visa interrupted that moment. It inserted weeks of waiting into ideas that needed days. It forced people to gather documents before they could even gather courage. It turned curiosity into calculation, and calculation into hesitation. Most plans didn't fail loudly. They expired quietly. This is why visas rarely produce outrage. They don't reject you immediately. They exhaust you slowly. A student doesn't get denied. They miss a semester. A trader doesn't get blocked. The buyer finds someone else. A freelancer doesn't get refused. The deadline passes. From the outside, nothing looks wrong. On the inside, opportunity evaporates. That's the part that disappears when visas disappear. By removing the visa, Ghana and Zambia didn't suddenly create new opportunities. They removed the delay that killed existing ones before they could mature. And removing delay changes behavior in ways people don't immediately notice. Before, people self-filtered. They asked whether something was worth the stress. They downsized ambition to match bureaucracy. They chose the safer, smaller option because the faster one came with paperwork. Now that the calculation has changed, the first effect isn't mass migration. It's an attempt. People try things they would have dismissed before. They explore instead of postponing. They act before doubt sets in. This is why governments usually defend visa systems with vague language about management and order. Because order sounds neutral. But what's really being managed is who gets to act while momentum is alive. Once that management tool is removed, the pace of life shifts. And here's the part most people overlook. This doesn't benefit everyone equally. It favors the fast, the young, the adaptable. The people are already thinking beyond one city or one country. That's why this decision lands differently with Gen Z. They don't plan for 10 years. They move, test, pivot. A system built on waiting was never designed for them. So the visa wasn't protecting borders. It was protecting slowness. And now slowness has been removed between Ghana and Zambia. Which brings us to the next layer. If momentum returns and people start acting instead of waiting, who actually moves first, and who gets left behind? The people who move first are not the loudest, they're the quickest. When the visa delay disappears, the advantage doesn't go to governments or institutions. It goes to individuals who already live in motion. People who spot gaps early. People who don't need permission to try. The first movers are not tourists taking selfies. They're students who apply late and still make it. Traders who hear about demand and act the same week. Freelancers who follow work instead of waiting for perfect conditions. Small operators who don't have departments to handle paperwork but do have speed. This is how the impact shows up, quietly and unevenly. Nothing explodes on day one. Airports don't flood. Headlines don't change. Instead, decisions compress. What used to take months now takes days. What used to require confidence now just requires curiosity. And once that happens, something subtle shifts: risk tolerance. Before, people avoided cross-border ideas because failure was expensive. If a plan didn't work, you'd wasted time, money, documents, and energy. Now failure is cheaper. You can try, adjust, return, and try again. Cheap failure produces experimentation. Experimentation produces learning. Learning produces competence. That's the chain reaction most policies never account for. This is why mobility favors the young disproportionately. Not because they're reckless, but because they have less to lose and more flexibility. Gen Z doesn't wait for systems to approve their ideas. They test first and explain later. Remove the waiting, and you remove the last excuse for staying still. But here's where it gets uncomfortable. When some people move faster, others notice. They see opportunities slipping across borders. They hear stories about places where things work better. They compare. And comparison doesn't stay personal. It becomes political. Once people cross once and return, they don't come back empty-handed. They bring expectations. They bring questions. They bring benchmarks. Why was it easier there? Why did this process work faster? Why do they treat people differently? That's when movement stops being just movement. It becomes information. And information destabilizes systems that depend on isolation. When people stay put, narratives stay intact. When people move, narratives compete. This is why the impact of visa-free travel is never immediate chaos. It's delayed pressure. Pressure built from lived comparison rather than ideology. And here's the key point. This pressure doesn't need organization. It spreads through conversation, through WhatsApp messages, through casual advice, through just go. It's easy now. That's how change moves without marching. Which leads to the next problem. If movement creates comparison, and comparison creates pressure, why have borders and delays been defended so stubbornly for so long? Let's pause for a second to say, big thank you to the Black Culture Diary community, where Black voices, stories, and legacies are preserved and amplified. By becoming a member, you're not just supporting the channel, you're becoming part of a powerful cultural movement. Let's continue. Because delays protect insulation. Borders didn't just separate countries, They separated consequences. When movement is slow, poor decisions stay local. Bad policies don't get exposed quickly. Inefficiency doesn't have to compete with efficiency. Delay buys time, and time hides weakness. That's why visa systems are defended with careful language. Not because they work brilliantly, but because they keep comparisons rare. If citizens can't easily cross, they can't easily benchmark. And if they can't benchmark, they can't ask sharp questions backed by experience. Another reason is quieter and less talked about: control of opportunity flow. When movement is filtered, access becomes selective. Only those with resources, connections, or patience make it through. That creates informal hierarchies. Gatekeepers emerge: brokers, fixers, intermediaries, people who make money not by creating value, but by navigating slowness. Delays are profitable. Remove them, and entire microeconomies collapse. No paperwork means no help with paperwork. No waiting means no leverage over who goes first. That's not a small loss for people who benefit from friction. There's also the performance issue. If people can leave easily, states must compete. Talent can relocate. Labor can shift. Ideas can move where they're treated better. Borders slow that competition down and keep mediocrity comfortable. That's why ease of movement is often framed as a security risk, not because people are dangerous, but because choice is. Choice exposes. And finally, there's fear of imbalance. When movement opens, not everyone wins at the same time. Some regions attract faster. Some lose people before they adjust. That transition is messy, and many governments prefer stagnation over adjustment. But stagnation has a cost too. It just shows up later. Ghana and Zambia accepted that cost up front. They chose exposure over insulation. That's the real decision here. Not openness for applause, but openness with consequences. And once exposure begins, it can't be contained to one agreement, because people talk, they compare. They ask why some doors open while others stay shut. And when those questions spread, pressure doesn't stay polite. So here's the tension now forming. If delay was protecting systems from comparison, and comparison is now happening, what happens when more countries face that same choice? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. What happens next is not imitation, it's exposure. Once Ghana and Zambia removed visas, they didn't just change policy for their own citizens. They created a reference point. And reference points are dangerous because they make excuses visible. From now on, every restriction elsewhere has to explain itself. Why is it easy to move there but hard here? Why can some Africans cross borders freely while others still wait? Why does paperwork disappear in one place but multiply in another? These questions don't come from activists or analysts. They come from people who have already crossed once and now know the difference. Experience sharpens critique better than ideology ever could. This is how pressure spreads without coordination. No one needs to campaign for visa-free travel anymore. The example does the work. Each successful crossing becomes proof that the system can function without delay. Each smooth entry weakens the argument that restriction is necessary, and this pressure doesn't hit all governments equally. Countries that already attract talent, investment, or opportunity feel it first. People begin to vote with their feet. Not permanently at first, but enough to send a signal. Enough to make leaders notice movement patterns they used to control. That's when the conversation shifts. What was once framed as sovereignty quietly becomes retention. How do we keep people? How do we compete? How do we stop losing momentum to places that move faster? Visa-free travel turns borders from shields into scoreboards. And here's the key detail that makes this different from past integration talk. Ghana and Zambia are not part of the same immediate bloc or neighborhood. This wasn't regional housekeeping. It was a long-distance decision. That tells other countries something important. You don't need proximity to justify trust. You don't need shared borders to open doors. You just need political will. Once that idea lands, delay becomes a choice, not a necessity. And when delay is clearly a choice, citizens stop accepting it as natural. They start asking who benefits from keeping things slow and why that benefit matters more than people's lives. That's when pressure stops being external and becomes internal. Not angry, not dramatic, persistent. So the agreement between Ghana and Zambia doesn't force anyone else to act. It simply makes inaction harder to defend. And that leads to the final tension in this story. If movement becomes normal in some places, and restriction starts looking intentional in others, who is actually prepared to live with that comparison? What this decision sets in motion isn't a policy trend, it's a habit change. Once people experience movement without friction, they recalibrate what feels normal. Waiting stops feeling responsible. Permission stops feeling legitimate. Delay starts looking artificial. And habits, once formed, are far harder to reverse than laws. This is the part governments usually underestimate. You can reintroduce paperwork. You can tighten the rules again. But you can't erase memory. People who have crossed easily once don't forget how unnecessary the struggle used to be. They carry that awareness into every future interaction with the system. Each new delay feels heavier. Each restriction feels more deliberate. And this is where the shift becomes irreversible. Because systems survive when people internalize them. The moment people stop believing waiting is just how things work, the system has to justify itself constantly. Justification is exhausting. Exhaustion leads to reform or irrelevance. Ghana and Zambia didn't force anyone to open borders. They forced everyone else to explain theirs. And explanations age badly. The more Africans move freely in some corridors, the more strange restriction looks elsewhere. Not immoral, not evil, just outdated. And nothing collapses faster than something that feels outdated to young people. This is why the impact won't show up in statistics first. It will show up in tone, in how people talk about borders, in how casually they plan across countries. How often do they ask, why not, instead of, can I? That tone shift is the real beginning. From here, outcomes branch. Some governments will compete by improving systems to retain people. Some will resist, tightening control and blaming external factors. Some will quietly follow, removing friction without announcing it. But none of them can pretend the question doesn't exist anymore. Because movement has already proven itself workable without collapse. And once something works once, it becomes harder to argue it's impossible elsewhere. This is why the Ghana-Zambia decision matters, even if no one copies it tomorrow. The test has already been run. The result is public. The excuse pool just shrank. What comes next won't be uniform. It won't be clean. It won't be announced at a summit. It will happen unevenly, through daily decisions by people who now know they don't have to wait by default. And that's the point of no return. So the final issue isn't whether visa-free travel will spread. It's this. When Africans stop waiting, who is actually ready to keep asking them to? Let us know in the comment section. Should travel inside Africa be visa-free? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about, the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.